go around the table. I'll say one thing to start us off. The reason I chose this book is because my dad had told me years ago that it was one of the books that he read. He's not a big reader. But when he was young, he had said he had read it. And then I asked him about it not too long ago after I had suggested it for the book club. And he said he actually read it several times. So I was very interested to read it because of that. So I'll go around and I don't know if you want to volunteer or if I should just pick one at a time here, but I'd like to hear what you all thought of the book before we jump into any questions.
So I've read it before and I absolutely loved it. And I'm so glad to revisit it because I don't remember it nearly as well as I thought I would. And it's just so beautifully written. The stories are so rich. We know so many characters so well, and it's not too much. It's just perfect. It's such a great book. Thanks for recommending that.
Okay, great. Who else wants to give an overall impression?
Well, I had not read the book before. However, I had seen the film, and I had the film in the back of my mind, sort of, but I really enjoyed the book. And then I went back and watched the film twice again. And the first time I had an okay idea. They tried. It was very loyal to the book. Practically all the dialogue is exactly the same. But they made some crucial, weird changes in things. But I ended up the second time not really thinking it was a very good adaptation at all. But it's very hard to capture, I think, the ease with which Maugham moves through the story, even though it seems very sort of segmented, because he's moving from place to place and says, I'm going to go back and tell you this story. But he's just a great storyteller. And it's the way it happens when people are telling a story to you verbally. They say sometimes it occurs to them, there's something I want to fill you in on. And that's kind of the way it was, kind of conversational. And I really enjoyed that a lot.
Robert, where did you have access to the film?
It's on, I got it on Amazon Prime. So I'm an Amazon Prime member, and I had it, once I opened it, I was able to watch it for 3 days, but my partner hadn't seen it. So then the next night I said, can we just watch it again? I really want to, there are a couple things I need to check on. So we watched it all again. He really thought it had a lot of problems.
So I want to know, which version of the film are we talking about now? Did you watch the
1946 version?
Okay, I watched that one too. It's also on YouTube if anyone wants to watch it for free.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, and I haven't watched the. We can talk about the film at the end, I think.
Yeah.
But and I'd also like to know if anyone watched the Bill Murray, because I'm kind of interested to watch that one.
Yeah, I haven't seen it.
No. Who's up next?
I'll go next. I guess one thing I found about the book that was embarrassing, which shows the value of sitting in with everybody, for which I'm very grateful. I'd never read Somerset Maugham, and I thought it was a lady, which is kind of embarrassing. I now know that she's a he, but in relation to the book, very easy to read, extraordinarily well written, has great play on words, good way to expand a vocabulary forever and ever. I guess maybe the one thing that I felt a little bit, I don't know, interesting, and it was there and it wasn't there. Having come out of World War II, which obviously very much affected the search for truth and meaning, but didn't really mention as the wandering through Germany and all, and in parts of France, how destructive World War I had been. And it was being written during a horrible time in World War II. So I don't know. I thought it was sort of interesting that it kind of broached on the thousands of bodies on one or two occasions, and maybe that's good. Maybe that just didn't have anything to do with the story, but I thought it was sort of interesting that that was going on. And then the other thing, while I had not read Somerset Maugham, I've read an awful lot of Barbara Tuchman, and she wrote a book by the name of Proud Tower, which is about the disintegration of the aristocracy in England. And I thought it was interestingly reflected here as he talked about um, the various gets together in France and then in Monaco and all that, as the royalty was becoming the former royalty, and they were sort of grasping at things. But all in all, very enjoyable book. I liked it. Really a fast read, and glad I got to read it.
Yeah, it was a fun read. Next, who's going to jump next?
You're on mute, Miriam. You're on mute.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll jump in here. I have a different opinion about this book. I found it rather stale somehow. And I enjoyed it most when the narrator was at his most acerbic, vinegary estimation of people. That to me was interesting. The narrator is completely taken with how people look. And it's endlessly about how the women look, how the men look, and all about appearances. I understand where Maugham is coming from. He's playing, American materialism and the almost rabid, interest in money that occurs before the stock market crash, which he mentions. It's 1929 when this whole world falls to pieces. That contrasted with Larry, who goes to India and he's on this sort of spiritual quest. I found the character of Larry interesting. And I found the characterization of Elliot, who's the most quintessential snob. I thought that was very, very well done, especially when he dies and they have to dress him up in this preposterous royalty and all of that. I thought it was also interesting that Larry goes to India, so it sort of presaged that. I remember when the Beatles went to India. So that whole business of, going to the East and looking for the answers to does God exist? What is the meaning of life? And then I thought there was a very interesting passage when he asked Isabel to just come away with him and they'll live on his $3,000 a year. And
Pounds.
Yeah, he outlines all the things that they will do. And of course, she's completely horrified. But when I read it, I thought, oh, gee, this sounds kind of nice. And an interesting way to live. But I don't know, the books seem, so dated to me in a way. So I can't be enthusiastic about it.
Well, that's fair. It's good to have a contrarian view. Maybe we'll have more. Let's go, Charles.
Yes, I love the narrator. I mean, the concept of the narrator, just observing, pecking at people, so to speak. I didn't find it a page turner. It took me a while to read it. But as I read segments of it, I enjoyed it. I took notes. There were certain quotes. I've always played with the idea of writing a memoir just for my family. But Somerset Maugham, he's so judgmental. And there's, when he says, you killed her to Isabel, That was, wow, that was not harsh. In the movie, it's a lot more direct, the connection, but it certainly was direct enough in the book. She wanted her to go off the deep end. And while in the movie she kills herself, here she's killed. It's the same result, that once she puts the liquor, and by the way, I've got nothing against liquor, nothing at all. As a matter of fact, the next time we get together, I am going to, I've already looked it up. You can get it in the United States. I'm going to bring a bottle of Zabrovka.
Oh,
It's all-
really?
Yeah, is that all right with everybody?
Yes.
But
Have you had it before?
never. I've had Chopin, but
But
I've
Charles,
never had, you know.
Charles, but who are you trying to like do in?
Yeah.
Nobody actually. So if I have to have bad intentions, maybe I'll bring soda pop or something like that. But you know, I didn't find Larry all that inspiring, tell you the truth. I'm curious to see how he did 5-6 years later after he gave up the money, because
He was fine.
I don't know. He took pretty good care of himself in between, you know, finding himself in India. You know, he found himself with Suzanne, and they had a good time. And and by the way, I thought Suzanne, the professional mistress,
Yeah.
I thought she was the second most interesting character in the book. I thought she was fabulous. So
She came in too late, though. She was so.
Yeah.
I guess,
wish
well,
there was-
but there was, you know, but, you know, for a supporting role, I nominated her for a book Oscar. But I just think Somerset Maugham was fabulous in it, because my whole perception of the narrator is kind of like watching it from above, and he just got into the people. I mean, when you talk about describing people's physical and such like that, you know, and Maugham, I love the words. I love his words play. He was just so bright. He had a little bit of, certainly showed some prejudice of different kinds of people. You didn't want to be a Corsican and be around him, and he didn't have, you know. And there were other times when of other minorities, but there's such great phrases in it. Silence is also a conversation, which I thought was just such a remarkable. So for me, it was just pieces of the book that I enjoyed, and the development of Somerset Maugham as a character. He was a narrator, but I thought he was the major character in the book personally. So I appreciate whoever chose this, and I found it not stale, actually. And for me to disagree with Miriam, who I think her comments are just so brilliant, is unusual. But maybe because I had never read Maugham before, that I found it very fresh. So thank you, whoever picked this book out.
All right. So I think Doreen and Ben, but who's going to be first here?
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Doreen. I'm glad to go last.
Okay. I laughed a lot out loud. I mean, the idea of like creating a library and there's no more space for books, I thought that was hilarious. And there were other parts that just made me laugh out loud. And I'm, hopelessly romantic. I love to travel. I'm fascinated by culture. I'm very interested in what is the meaning of life and spirituality. I love the narrator. I love the conversationality of it. I loved going to Chicago and France and Paris and then the French countryside and London, the travel aspects. It was totally my kind of book. And yes, references were dated, but I found the concepts not dated. And I really enjoyed it. And I laughed a lot. Thank you.
It was a privileged view of the world. Ben.
Oh, well, I think we're going to have a fun discussion tonight, because I love it when there's disagreement. And first of all, let me say I'm always glad to read a classic. Always glad, whether to, let's say, confirm or to debunk. And in this case, I'm going to be a little sharper than usual. I thought the book was a failure on a number of levels. The narrator I didn't find believable. And he hems and haws about this, but he adds a lot of fiction. And he says, well, I think it was kind of like this, kind of like that. The old world filtering the new was really condescending for me. And also, he really didn't get Americanness, in my view. At one point, I think it was page 7, he talks about American ladies of title. Does anyone know what an American lady of title is? No, I think that's an English concept. But anyway.
Well, it means titled, entitled.
Well, he didn't say that. He said of title.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's
okay.
English.
All right, but let me continue. So the spiritual quests, for me, which would potentially be the most interesting part of the book, they largely came off as false for me. And I thought that he had a very superficial treatment of religion. Now, I'll say up front that I came a little bit biased against because I read Maugham's his book called A Writer's Notebook, in which he compiled what was it? Something like 100 journals into just one book on what it's like to become a writer. And actually, I picked that book up in a hotel in Cairo in my young 20s. It was in the desk drawer, and I had nothing better to do. I rather enjoyed it in my young 20s. For a project that I worked on, I had to go back and reread it a number of years ago. And with a slightly different eyes, I found it horrifying. What he admits about himself, and I don't normally go to the character of the author so quickly, and I didn't go to Wikipedia, I didn't study him, but from the writer's notebook, he is very honest about himself, and eugenicist just pops right out, a whole number of other things. Not a very nice character, who himself, I guess I actually wrote a book review about the writer's notebook, and came off as an insufferable egoist and materialist. So that was my bias going into it. And I have to admit, it probably did color the book a bit.
Tell us how you really felt about the author.
I warned you all I'd be a little bit sharper tonight, but I think it makes for a funner discussion. So thanks for suggesting it. I'm delighted for the opportunity.
As usual, Ben throws out a lot of interesting questions. The question of American materialism in the 20s versus the European materialism that they are immersed in, that just seems like swimming in water. But he does answer one thing that he said about the failure to deal with Americanism in the preface, which is interestingly the first chapter instead of a preface. He comes right out and says it's difficult to know and speak to people outside of one's own country, and what a mess Americans, the mess that English writers make when they try to do this is only equal by the mess American writers make when they try to reproduce English from England. So I'm interested. I'm curious that the character of the narrator did not seem real to you, because I had the opposite impression. I felt like he really convinced me that it was almost happened exactly the way he wrote it, that it was so casual and conversational and detailed and filled with things that weren't really necessary to the plot at all, that it seemed just more natural that this was his experience and he's just turning it into a literary experience. But be curious about we're going to talk about the narrator, but before we do that, in fact, we'll make that the first question. We'll jump into that first. But as far as myself, I think he had me when with the Larry decision about both Larry and Isabel in the beginning, the whole idea of the road not taken. I loved the way it got just set up there in the beginning very dramatically, that each one has to choose a very different course in life. And that I think I could relate to from my own life. And so I think, just bought right into what the book was trying to do from that frame. But let's talk about the character of the narrator. So one of my questions was, the narrator is prominent in the story, and at times he can be quite judgmental of characters. And many examples of that towards the beginning, that he's savage in his estimation of them, even when they're doing nothing except being. I mean, if he called Isabel fat one more time in the beginning chapters, I'm sure that's one of the things that turned you off mightily, Miriam, how ugly his judgment was, and his interest in people judging each other. But he also engages in the fates of the characters, as I think that was you saying, Charles, about him being the main character in some way. So I just want people to talk about the narrator as character and the effect of this on the reader and on the characters in the story and the story itself. So how did you, I mean, we all know what it did, but how did you feel about this?
I can just say one thing. I think when you think about a narrator in this sense of this book, and you think of someone like Dickens, who's unbelievably opinionated in his characterization of people, and he certainly lets you know just as much as Maugham does how he feels about individuals. I just wonder how much difference there is. Of course, there's an engagement, a direct engagement with the narrator with all these people, and he says things directly to them that the novelist couldn't necessarily do. But I hesitate to put him in such a different category. As the narrator, he becomes a character, but he uses the voice of the narrator to express feelings he has about everybody in the story. He talks about the sensuousness of Larry's mouth more than I have ever considered the sensuousness of anybody's mouth. But that's because he was fixated about it, and it was very alluring to him. That's something a novelist could also do. So I don't know. I'm a little confused about the difference, if there is one.
If I can jump in, the interesting thing is I'm really not sure why the narrator, and by the way, the narrator is, at least on page 140, seems to be called Lanvin, and earlier he's called Maugham. So I don't know if anyone found that as confusing as I did. So it seems like, well, what is the name of the narrator? I'm not really sure. Whoever the narrator is, I'm not sure of his interest in Larry. I'm actually a lot more sure of Maugham's interest in Larry, because one of his writings in the writer's notebook that I mentioned is there's a passage where he writes of a young writer friend's inheritance of a small annual sum. And I won't go through, on such an income, a young man will not starve, but it is small enough for him to enjoy little comfort, and comfort is the writer's bitterest foe. He goes on then essentially about how wonderful that would be. And that is essentially Maugham, I think, as a younger writer than when he wrote this book, is describing Larry's life. So it's kind of like Larry is, to me, clearly the alter ego for Maugham. But the narrator, I don't really get it, to be honest, because the narrator comes off with all sorts of, he calls others snobbish when he himself evidences great amounts of it. He's condescending. He seems to have flashes of insight, but I'm not persuaded. I did read a book in parallel that I reread, Mario Vargas Llosa's Letters to a Young Novelist, and in it he describes the power of persuasion as being essential in a narrator. And this narrator just didn't do that for me. It was an easy read. Don't get me wrong. It was an easy read, the book, but I'm not quite sure who the narrative is or why he's obsessed with Larry.
And Isabel.
There's one point in the book where I think it's Isabel says to him, to the narrator, "I'm afraid." And then the narrator, who's, a stand-in for Maugham, says that he reacted to that genuine expression of feeling with a sense of awe, but it's as if he himself can't do that, is not capable of doing it. I found the narrator's point of view on the cool side. I don't say this as a judgment, but it's a step removed. There's one point he said, "Well, if I hadn't run into Larry, I probably never would have seen him again." So it's a detached point of view, except when he's, describing how awful people look or how great people look or how wonderfully beautiful they are, So how is he involved with these people? He sees them 4 times a week, but he himself does not reveal his inner life. That's just not there.
I think he's, excuse me.
I'm sorry, Charles, what?
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's okay, go ahead.
I think he's more of a voyeur than a real flesh and blood character. I mean, I enjoyed him. I didn't.
Good point. That's a good point.
And I didn't feel like I had to like him to enjoy him. He didn't have the courage to do certain things. He had good common sense, I mean, from the standpoint of, I thought he gave Larry great advice. You've always had money, so it's easy for you to think that you don't need money. And he was very spot on with people, but he was also generous. He went to a different city to identify Sophia's body, and paid the money for her funeral, and gave her that kind of dignity. But he always seemed like looking in. He never seemed like really part of anything. You didn't know a whole lot. I think the point you make, Miriam, is exactly right. You didn't really learn too much about who was Somerset Maugham, and I think he had a lot of conflict, whether he was looking at Larry's lips or he was describing Isabel's body or whatever it is. And I think that if there was anything real, it was that conflict of his own sexuality in the book, which was Somerset Maugham in his persona. But I like the narrator as a voyeur. I do, and I especially like the fact that he was not kind of a saintly voyeur. He was not like the angel that comes down and It's a Wonderful Life. He had an opinion on everybody. And I've known people like that.
I think voyeur is a good way to put it. My question would be, what does the narrator learn? How is he impacted and changed by the characters? And I'm not sure there is any.
I would just say that he's a writer. And I think, I don't mean to, I guess it sounds judgmental, but what the heck? He's like a vampire. He sucks their personalities out and then transform them and put them on paper. So I think everything. He's there when he's needed. He's there when he's needed.
I don't think we need to know the interior life of this intrusive narrator, right? It's everyone else's story that we're following in this. And we get little glimpses of him now and again, especially the part when he talks about his painter lover, we get a little bit about him, but it's not about the change in the arc of his life. It's the change in the arc of Isabel and Larry and Elliot. Well, Elliot didn't change too much, but it's just the lives of the other people. And I think the intrusive narrator was able to pop out in a really beguiling way for me.
Well, but the question is, and it's really to Mark's second question of why, how does the narrator sort of change, or would we go directly to Larry's story, and how is it that the narrator? the narrator in a Dickens novel is really the third person author, right? Speaking in the omniscient authorial view. So the question here is, what is the narrator who speaks in first person when he's talking about himself and creating fiction when he's often talking about others? What does he add to the story? And why did Maugham, choose to do that instead of just going directly to a Dickinsonian third person, or do it from Larry's viewpoint?
Well, I think he adds the insight, and he draws us in, like he turns to us, the reader, and says, hey, and let me tell you about this too. You wouldn't have thought of this, but and then he turns back to the story. I find that intriguing, and that works for me, especially in this book.
I'm going to go with the simplest explanation for myself, which is I think he is being relatively honest in this whole thing. And he's showing himself as, he's very rooted. He's a dusty old European character who found himself, slowly able to penetrate the upper crust in Europe. And, the character of the author with Eliot is a pretty hilarious running gag. But I think it's really interesting to me how he starts off as, like someone who's just there to witness and record. And yet in the course of the conversations, you see how he's actually influencing, not just a listening board for the characters, but actually influencing them. And so by the end, he's telling her, telling Isabel what to do, and then accusing her of practically murder after she doesn't do it. So I think he's to me, it's an interesting transformation from the omniscient character to someone who is actually, in fact, a character in this story. And probably because I would bet that it largely happened in this way. There's probably a fair amount of artistic license, but it felt honest to me. I just felt he was honestly really ugly in his judgments, and some of his biases were really maybe dated, and that I might say was stale. Some of his his attitudes, and he was very old world like, but I thought it was a really interesting use of the character, because it seemed to me it almost changed between being the omniscient person who happened to be there to literally becoming an influential character.
Not the main.
I think he also made it clear when he was filling in some blanks. He'd say, I'm trying to relate this the way I remember it, but I'm sure I'm not getting it exactly right. And it was kind of like a good reporter, they say what they saw, but they know that there are some holes in their knowledge, and they let you, the hearer, know immediately, or the reader know immediately, that that's the way they should interpret how he's expressing what happened.
If it wasn't honest, it was really clever.
Yeah.
But anyone else want to comment on the narrator, or should we move to the quest?
Well,
Okay.
all I will say is that Maugham himself says it's his attempt to portray American characters through an English eye.
But did you think it was his eye?
Well, he says it is.
Well, it was kind of funny when he talked about Gray's use of cliches, like that whole paragraph of Gray speaking in cliches.
That was hilarious.
That was funny.
Gray never goes, when Gray's going to bed, he always says he's going to hit the hay.
Yeah, right. Well, my dad did too.
Yeah, and everybody says gosh at the most weird moments. The most profound moments, they say gosh. Yeah, I think those were a little bit of that flaw he admitted to in the beginning. So I thought you were going to say something, David. If not, I'm going to shift this on to the next. Okay. So we'll go back to the first question, which is about the whole quest. And so, I love one of the things in the preface, we get in the first chapter where he talks about, it may be that when his life comes to an end, he will leave no more trace in his sojourn on earth than a stone thrown in the river leaves on the surface of the water. But it may be that the way of life he has chosen for himself and the peculiar strength and sweetness of his character may have an ever-glowing influence over his fellow men. So, on the Maugham dimension of that, I can see why Larry was maybe something earlier version of himself that he wanted to project as kind of something to influence mankind. But
self-fulfillment's what he was about. He wanted self-realization and self-fulfillment. He needed answers to his own story.
But as to Larry's story now, so would it be a quest if there was not a narrator here? And how does Larry's story measure as a quest? Is he a hero going through adventures? He says he's loafing and he's on a trust fund and he seems to go randomly through life with a lot of coincidences and, just randomly does this or that. And so is that the quest? Let's open it up.
Well, I think he was talking about loafing in a very loose way. He just didn't want to have anybody ask him questions about what he was looking for, and he just said, "I'm loafing," and it irritated people because they didn't get any answers. But that's exactly what he wanted. He didn't want anybody asking him what he wanted because he didn't know. I thought that was fine. I'd much rather people who didn't know what they were doing would say that.
So it works as a quest.
Pardon me?
It works as a quest. You can see Larry as a hero on a quest, a spiritual quest.
Right. Now, whether
in fact, if you go to page 69, he himself says it pretty clearly.
Are we talking about the same version, same book?
Probably.
No.
Okay, but then let's see. So it's chapter 4. I think it's in part 2. Part 2, yes, chapter 4.
Yeah, okay.
So Larry says, quote, "I want to make up my mind whether God is or God is not. I want to find out why evil exists. I want to know whether I have an immortal soul or whether when I die it's the end." So Larry puts it out there to the narrator fairly clearly. One question I would have is, does he get any insight into those very questions by the end of the novel? I'm not quite sure. But to answer your question, Mark, I just don't. Larry's an interesting character, but I don't personally see that he would have been able to be the narrator. His story alone would have been enough interest or depth, because although he was centric for the time to give up materialism, he was, in my view, kind of shallow at the same time. So I don't think a book would not have stood on his shoulders alone. So I think in that sense, Maugham made a correct choice.
Maugham has a difficult time dramatizing Larry, because for a large part of this novel, Larry spends his time reading. He reads for most of the day. So
that's why my life is so boring.
How do you dramatize that? How do you dramatize that?
Uh-oh.
And has Larry found the answers? Well, I guess you could say he does this sort of St. Francis action. He gives all his money away, and then he's going to go on to a boat I think it's in Marseille. And then eventually he plans to go to New York and become a taxi driver.
Which is all admirable. I like that about him, but I don't think he answered any of his own questions.
No, those questions, of course, are unanswerable.
Okay, but maybe that's the point.
So maybe that is the point. But he avoids marrying Isabel. I can't imagine how that marriage could have ever succeeded. She has a lot of self-knowledge, which I find very, very interesting. In my book, which is this one, I have the same one Ben has. She says what she she, that she says to Larry, "You're so impractical." This is on page 71. "You don't know what you're asking me to do. I want to go to parties. I want to do all the things that people do." Oh, wait a minute. "I want to go to dances. I want to play golf and ride horseback. I want to wear nice clothes. Can't you imagine what it means to a girl not to be as well dressed as the rest of her crowd? Don't you know what it means, Larry, to buy your friends old dresses when they're sick of them and be thankful when someone out of pity makes you a present of a new one? I couldn't even afford to go to a decent hairdresser to have my hair properly done. I don't want to go about in streetcars and omnibuses. I want to have my own car. And what do you suppose I'd find to do with myself all day long while you were reading at the library? Walk about the streets window shopping or sit in the Luxembourg Gardens seeing that my friends' children didn't get into mischief? We wouldn't have any friends." So she knows herself. I said to myself, well, why don't you go study something, make yourself useful? But she's really a society person, and she wants all of the pleasures of upper middle class life.
But then why is she obsessed with Larry? So that's perhaps one of the more interesting. That's like, well, what is it? Why does she idolize Larry?
Got to understand true love.
Yeah, I don't think she idolized him. She just loved him.
Yes.
The heart has its reason that reason doesn't know.
They're opposite. They're opposite.
I think it's interesting to talk about Isabel in a lot of different ways, because I think she's much more key than Larry is in terms of the bulk of the novel. We learn much more about her than we do about Larry.
Well, I want to put a pin in that, Robert, because we're going to get to her next.
All right, I'll wait.
I want to finish the question. Does the quest succeed? What does he come back with?
More
Liz?
questions, same questions.
Well, he apparently is a healer. Isabel's husband, Gray, who suffers from terrible migraines. Larry performs these various actions and he heals him. So he's come back with some sort of healing power, which I thought that was interesting. But as far as answering the questions, I think he comes back really with a sort of freedom. He really does cut the ties completely, and goes off on the ship from Marseille. So that's what he comes back with.
I thought he embraced.
He writes a book.
I thought he embraced Eastern religions instead of Christianity.
Mhm.
So in that sense, he doesn't choose either the United States or Europe. He chooses something else. So yeah, I thought, and then he could be at peace going back home because he was at peace with himself.
So he does have a mystical moment. He does have a transcendent moment where he experiences God, which is what he wanted to find meaning, and he found it. And then he does come back as this almost saintly character who's a healer just from apparently from his projections. People seem to feel like, especially with his healing with Sophie, which was underway, but also, so it's, I would say that it is, for me, it does, even though it's got a lot of quotation marks around it from the loafing, which I agree is a put off is actually I think it's seen as a noble thing to be industriously reading all these subject areas and educating yourself. It's called the path to worldly wisdom, right? As the Indian guru refers to it. So I do think it, in the end, adds up as a quest, and I think it's interesting in that respect. Would it have been a quest? Would it have been a hero? Would he have been a hero if it wasn't recorded by Maugham? I think back to what he says about the that somebody who's telling the story of somebody who, you know, jettisoned his world of, I can't remember the story well now, maybe each one of you can, but he ends up harming his whole family and producing a lot of garbage. And sure enough, Larry, when he wrote his great book, it was just a small collection of garbage as well. Just random educational essays.
He has an ecstatic experience in the Far East.
Right.
This is on page 275. He says, I have no descriptive talent. I don't know the words to paint a picture. I can't tell you so as to make you see it. How grand the sight was that was displayed before me as the day broke in its splendor. Those mountains with their deep jungle, the mist still entangled in the treetops, and the bottomless lake far below. The sun caught the lake through a cleft in the heights, and it shone like burnished steel. I was ravished with the beauty of the world. I had never known such exaltation and such transcendent joy. I had a strange sensation, a tingling that arose in my feet and traveled up to my head, and I felt as though I was suddenly released from my body, and this pure spirit partook of a loveliness I had never conceived. I had a sense that a knowledge more than human possessed me, so that everything that had been confused was clear, and everything that had perplexed me was explained. So here is, he experiences this transcendent rapture. So that's what he does reach. This is at the ashram, I think. Yeah. So I take back what I said about his not realizing anything. It doesn't exactly answer his questions, but it's this ecstatic experience of the beauty of the world where he feels he becomes all spirit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It made me think of when I was at the University of Chicago for a while, and I wrote this paper in a philosophy class comparing Teresa of Avila and the Daubert of Lubavitch. And they're both are experiences of ecstasy. And it was very close to the way that it's described here. And of course, it's the same image that's in sculpture or bas-relief on the top in St. Peter's. That's actually her experience of the ecstatic knowledge that she got from God. So I thought it was very true to me.
And this is well done. This is an expression, and that's certainly what he wanted to experience, you know.
Right.
Well, you know, what Miriam and what you were saying, I think points out how beautiful Maugham writes.
Yeah.
You know, I found Larry to be rather one-dimensional, though. I would ask the question not whether he was in a quest, but did he wind up? Why did he leave? If this was where he had this great moment, why did he leave it? And did he view himself as a missionary to bring this to the world?
Well, the guru told him he couldn't stay. He said, "You must go." He said, "I want to stay." And the guru said, "No, you have to go."
That was in the movie. In the book, I think he just came back from this experience and he said it's time to go. And he didn't even say anything to the guru. The guru just understood that he had had this experience.
That's the way I remember the book. Yeah.
I shouldn't have seen the movie twice after I read the book.
By the way, I like yours.
So Mark, can you tell us what you're showing? Because actually I can't see when people are speaking because of the screen share. So what did you put up on the screen share? Does everyone see it?
Yeah.
And what is that, Mark?
So I put it up because we're talking about that moment of spiritual rapture. And in the movie, this was actually him simply leaving that point.
It looks like a storyboard from the movie.
It is. I took a picture with my phone of the movie, the 1946 movie. And yeah, that's his place of rapture. So
Can I just add, so, obviously he does come to Eastern mysticism, which is largely Buddhist. And a couple of pages before where Miriam was just reading, he says the multitudinous gods of India are but expedients to lead to the realization the self is one with the supreme self. And so I would say he doesn't have an encounter with the God. He has encounter with gods because Eastern mysticism is that we all have gods within us. So it's pantheism. And so yes, he does come to that realization. But I mean, I would, if for a Westerner's view on Eastern mysticism, I would highly recommend Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha as being far more profound and involving than Larry's journey, which is kind of going in the same direction, but it, again, for me, was not persuasive.
See, for me, it was more about like everyone is trying to define what is life about. So for Eliot, it's aristocracy. And for Isabel, it's, middle class materialism. And for Larry, it's finding the spirit in every object of life and every person in life, and it's spirituality. And so if it had only been Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, that would have been, for me, very one-dimensional. And what I found so delightful about this book was like that juxtaposition of these different characters, including the narrator, looking at them all. So they're all foils for each other and they play off each other. And that's the beauty and the fun. So you have, the rapture, and then you have the preposterousness, as Miriam called it, of Eliot. And if you didn't have all of that, aristocracy versus not aristocracy, you make your money in the stock market, but then you lose it. Gambling versus title, American versus English, Eastern mysticism versus Christianity, and the different passages he goes through. He's loafing because he doesn't have the answer yet. If you ask him, he couldn't tell you yet. So until he gets there, he can't really talk about it. That's why you need the narrator. I don't know. That's how I saw it.
Mm-hmm.
What I found is, we've all been not critical, but we've all been observant on how the narrator, Somerset, is kind of judgmental and can be very harsh on people. And yet I found the last part of the book to be so charitable. It's so open, where he says, everybody got what they want. Yeah. Eliot's social eminence, Isabel an assured position backed by a substantial fortune in an active and cultured community. Gary, a steady and lucrative job, blah, blah, blah. Suzanne, security. Sophie, death. And Larry, happiness. The only person he doesn't consider a success in his writing, at any rate, is himself. And he was certainly a character in this book. So
I guess that was the part that bothered me. I felt he was sort of rushing to feel, okay, I've written a really interesting story, and now I've got to finish and put it into a package. And Larry goes off to California and becomes the founder of Uber or something. I don't know.
Yeah, and do we agree with the narrator's assessment of each character coming, flowering in each of those kind of cliche phrases? I'm not sure, because they didn't ring all true to me.
Well, Sophie's death certainly didn't. I don't view hers as a success. But I think the others, assuming that Larry found happiness, everybody got what they wanted.
Yeah.
Well, he starts off saying, I have a little story to tell, and I end neither with death nor marriage. So if you think of and they lived happily ever after, right? And that's death and marriage. So he wrapped it up. I don't know. It didn't bother me.
And
I didn't find it.
His first sentence is, I've never begun a novel with more misgiving. But ends,
Well-
I guess, with success for all.
I'm going to take the Sophie death as a cue to go into the next question, and we're not going to probably get to all the questions here, but this is a really good one. It's what you wanted to talk about before, Robert.
Yeah.
Well, so Sophie, I thought that was super powerful at the end. The idea that Sophie was questing for death, and that's what she was seeking, and all that. But so I love this line. It's repeated twice, or it's repeated.
We all say it together.
She's bad.
She's bad.
Love that line from Isabel. And you're right to read about the foils. I wrote that in my notes on this book multiple times. About he uses foils constantly, even in a single scene. Someone appears differently, looking with one person than versus with another person. So how does we got to look at Sophie and Isabel as these foils, and then also they're not just their life choices and what happens to them, but Larry's view. I mean, his ultimate kind of casual view, description of how he reconciles good and evil, the fact that they're connected, basically, and that they're not separate voices.
Sophie is deeply wounded by the death of her child and her husband in an automobile accident, and she really never recovers from that, and seems to be seeking complete oblivion. The tie-in with Larry is that his life was bought by another person's death. And that's referred to a few times. And that was interesting to me. And so he also is touched by death, but it pushes him in a very, very different direction. His life is bought by the person who
Saved his life, yeah.
Yeah, who dies saving him.
We keep on asking the question, why was she so obsessed with Larry? Well, we don't know we don't know the prequel. We don't know who Larry was before he went to war. I mean, we got a sense that he was like everybody else. He liked fun. It was this and that. And I think that's when she fell in love with him. And she just couldn't get that out of her mind. She was always in love with the Larry before World War I.
They grew up together. They were
Together.
growing up in the same household so your classic childhood, teenage crush.
Yeah, and that's what's mentioned so many times, is how the three of them grew up together. And it creates this whole backstory that we only hear about when we find out that Larry wants to marry her. It's just like, what? Nobody's going to understand. But he saw something in her that long ago time that he really thought could be retrieved. And because I think he'd gone through this experience of healing, he really felt he could do something for her. So I think he's very noble, in wanting to reach out and to deliver this healing to other people. Unfortunately, she didn't have the same idea, I guess, after a while.
We're trying to save others. One thing about it, and it was a little bit melodramatic when he finally told the story of his life being, given a gift of the comrade who died. And he says towards the end of that confession that the dead look so awfully dead.
Yeah.
Which is okay. That sounds a little bit shallow, but I think, Mark, you're referring to, it's on page 105 in my book, where Larry it says he added that evil is as direct a manifestation of the divine as good. Is that what you were referring to? And it's rather early in the book.
No. It's a chapter that does sound like it, but I thought that there was something in the chapter. I have to say, I read this several weeks ago now. Late in the book, the chapter that he would not have written the book but for this conversation in the cafe after the theater. And I think towards the end of that, I thought he said the same thing, basically, the existence of evil, how does he explain, and just that they're just almost inseparable ideas. So that's why, so she's bad, bad, bad. I mean, who is that? Who's the bad one here? And that's really I love the irony of that part, because is Isabel really bad? And does she think she's just protecting him, and this is a failed person who's going to let him down? Or
I came away with a very strong opinion about, I think Isabel was a terror. I think she was horrible and mean and selfish. I just didn't buy this whole thing of her being so understanding. Every time she gets engaged in an argument with Larry about the value of American life. Oh, you're missing out on so much. It's such a great thing. And it's clear to her that it should have been that he didn't really care about that. But she keeps on insisting on these arguments that don't go anywhere. And then she turns away in dismay because she's not successful. Well, she doesn't get him. And she keeps trying in spite of the fact that it's not working. And all she has is this long-held belief that she's in love with him.
Well,
and she's young, and and that's all she knows at that time.
Yeah.
But I think she's a
Didn't he
horribly
not have a mother?
manipulative person.
Absolutely.
I mean, even with her own daughters, they turn to her husband for love, and then she's the disciplinarian. That you will dress this way, you will do that. She a very judgmental. And I think that was her attraction to Larry, at least initially. In the book, when they were in Chicago and all that, he goes, "Oh, I don't know anything," and then she goes, "Well, but I do." Yeah.
She's no doubt, for me, the novel's biggest reveal, because she starts out, for me at least, as seems like an attractive character, and the narrator is obsessed with her looks and her beauty. We know that, but then he himself, on page 188, refers to her as looking like the BITCH in heat. So he sours a bit on her, but doesn't, because then it's like, oh no, she's just a truth teller all the time. And it's what I really like about her, is that she's a straight shooter.
Yeah, in that same place, he says, the beauty was stripped from her face. The look upon it made her hideous and frightening. Mm. It horribly suggested the bitch in Heat, and I felt rather sick. It's amazing. So, I think he was subject to enlightenment too.
So I just wanted the part about evil, right? He's looking for, is there God, and what is the nature of evil? And on page 279, he says, the best I can suggest is that when the absolute manifested itself in the world, evil was the natural correlation of good. You could never have had the stupendous beauty of the Himalayas without the unimaginable horror of a convulsion of the earth's crust. The Chinese craftsman who makes a vase in what they call eggshell porcelain can give it a lovely shape, ornament it with a beautiful design, stain it with a ravishing color, and give it a perfect glaze, but from its very nature, he cannot make it anything but fragile. If you drop it on the floor, it will break into a dozen fragments. So it's inevitable. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in my book, he found what he was looking for. He found God was in all things, and evil and good, like yin and yang, are correlated.
Yeah.
Thank you, Doreen. Everything. The passage that I was looking for, that I remember. And, she's really, in the end, I'm so sympathetic to Sophie's depth and feeling, which Larry shared with her early on in the childhood. And you're right, actually, he grew up with both. He grew up with in the neighborhood with her, and then in the family in Chicago with Isabel. And Isabel, shallow, who's attractive, but in the end, only so deep. so it's a very interesting, they make very interesting foils for each other. And then Suzanne sort of comes across, I guess, as the blend, the one who's got a little bit, had bad cards dealt with her, but was managed to be sensitive and sensible and sort of find the middle way. I don't know. I do think she was introduced quite late in the story.
Yeah. I wish she had come in sooner for a little relief, because she was I liked her character. She was fascinating.
That's a good observation, because somehow I was taken aback when all of a sudden we started following her story there,
Yeah.
half or 2/3 way through. But in the end, I mean, I think I see why he put her in there, but
Yeah.
it was a little bit forced. Well,
Just a little more on the subject of evil. The sentence after Doreen stopped reading, because and it's kind of the payoff sentence, is, isn't it possible in the same way that the values we cherish in this world can only exist in combination with evil? And so, yes, I mean, that is Eastern mysticism, because then there's not a outside God who actually could be perfect and all good, and instead we're a big mix of everything. Even though in that pantheistic system, it's hard to say, well, who gets to say what is good and what is evil? Because that's kind of assuming there's actually a judger, or there's a way to tell the difference.
Ben, I think it's to some ways just the opposite. I think that what he's describing more than Eastern religion, at least a little bit I understand of it, is Western religion. Because what need would we have for the Redeemer if there was no evil?
Well, the world is fallen, and so yes, evil came in, but that was not the intention of the Creator God. That was not his best plan, let's say.
So you agree with the Woody Allen theory that God is an underachiever?
One of his best lines.
Very good line.
But rather that we didn't quite hack it, because we were given free will.
Right.
So I'm going to, we only have, I mean, I think people generally like to try to wind down around 8:30 here. And I think maybe the way that let us spend the last part of our time is to see, I mean, here are the questions that I was thinking about, but just leave it open for people to comment on anything they want to. And just very quickly, there's a lot of, we're looking at wealth, the tip of the iceberg here, but there's a lot of there's a lot of people serving those wealthy all throughout, and the whole idea of caste and is really strong in this book. And then another question that I was interested in is the idea of America, Europe, and India as being characters set against each other in the wake of the Great War, where it's the nations battling, and he's actually writing it, as was pointed out, during another Great War. Another question, I'm always interested when there's so much reference, so much sophisticated and knowing reference to paintings, sculpture, design, interior design, writing and collecting and selling, and the people looking like art themselves. And so I'm interested in that, because this is a story of spiritual seeking and what that means. And then the last thing I'm going to throw out, and then I'm going to let you all just give me your thoughts on it, any of these things. But I was curious about the idea that Maugham is writing all this in Paris at a time when there was a really profound group of writers, largely based in Paris, in writing about the lost, or called the Lost Generation, and writing about these these very new modern themes. So I was just curious what people thought about that fact, because he's set in the same city at the same time. But we had very little reference to them, except maybe an allusion to a poem by Eliot towards the end, and that Sophie had. And then I really, when I read the first time of the Larry and Isabel's debate, when they're having their fork in the road conversation, it was so cinematic to me. I just instantly, thought I was reading a movie like Casablanca when I was reading that dialogue. The movie itself that I watched does not add up to that. It does way falls short of the cinematic quality of the writing and the things that they're wrestling with. But I wonder if anyone else thought it was cinematic, and I kind of speculate that he might have actually seen Casablanca when he was finishing his writing here. It might have been an influence, but that's total speculation. So we just take your time, go around and tell me what things you respond to or that you wanted to note, or something else that you wanted to observe about the book.
Yeah, I could say a few things. When I think about Paris during the 20s with Stein, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Pound, Eliot was more in England, Pound in Italy, James Joyce was there as well. And when I compare Maugham's writing,
We can't see you, Miriam. Somehow we lost your video.
Oh, okay. Okay. When I think of comparing Somerset Maugham to these writers, that's when I find him stale. And if I could compare him to F. Scott Fitzgerald, who's this absolutely marvelous writer, to compare him to James Joyce, it seems that Maugham doesn't measure up to what was going on. Not
because he's old school, or based on talent and literary style? I mean, it's like he's not a modern. He doesn't share their sensibility. He is of the old school.
He's not a modernist, and somehow he seems, I guess there's no progress in the arts, as someone once said, but compared to these writers, for me, he doesn't measure up.
I liked your question, Mark, and the echoes that I saw was perhaps Maugham, because he did, as you noted, wrote this really in the middle of World War II. But it seemed to me like he already read Great Gatsby, and this was kind of a British take on an American duality, right, between an Eliot and a Larry. And so it was his attempt to do this. But I just have to say, he was one of the highest paid writers in the 30s, writing in English at least. And I think he's overrated because it just doesn't compare well to the list you came up with.
I loved him. I thought he wasn't as cynical as Fitzgerald. I personally hate The Great Gatsby. I think it's disgusting. I don't find any character in there likable. And I really like Larry. And I really like the Eastern mysticism in there. And I think it's, I like books that put together like The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. I love that book. It had politics, it had spirituality, it had romance, it had an interesting cast of characters, much more interesting than The Great Gatsby. Oh my God. I think I like this better.
Melissa, you were going to say something similar?
Yeah, I
Um,
love this book, and I love the art. And I thought the like Eliot's take on art was funny. Like he didn't like the new guys like Matisse and Picasso, and I just thought that was a great foil for who he was. He was of the old school, you know. And I love the art that was woven including the artist model, you know, and just like in the day-to-day Parisian life. I thought it was great. Loved it.
And then he didn't want to say he was an art dealer, right?
Right, right.
That was
He didn't want
filthy.
to go there. Like, that's really how I make my money, but I'm not going to tell anybody because I'm above that, you know, like I'm helping them with their, it was just hilarious.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Totally right. Totally right.
There's a lot of humor.
I thought he had an interesting commentary about art, which is maybe sort of a sub story. In the case of Suzette, when she's painting, and she admits that maybe one of the paintings was pretty good and the rest of them weren't, but that her future husband had the money to be able to get her into the greatest gallery in Paris and to buy off the art critics so they would say that it's great. Which then gets you to sometimes art is in the eyes of the beholder and can perhaps be created, which I thought was sort of an interesting side note. But in relation to Somerset Maugham himself, I found something interesting that Miriam said at the very beginning, and contrasting it, that it was dated. That's the way I feel about Hemingway. I don't enjoy Hemingway at all. I get tired with Hemingway and feel like, okay, it's kind of, yeah, it was, and now it's not. I didn't get the feeling with this book. I don't think it's a huge, wonderful, great piece of literature, but I thought it was well written. It was interesting, very descriptive, great play on words, and all kinds of comparisons in it. So I don't know. I thought it was an enjoyable book.
Well, I'm going to posit that I think the focus on art, and I don't remember if it's Suzanne or Suzette, but her, you know, her immersion into painting was so emblematic of it too. But that art itself, the creation of art, and then the existence of art is sort of parallel with this idea of seeking, you know, spiritual seeking. So certainly there's something to be explored there. If we were going to analyze it more deeply, there's definitely a lot of conscious thought about art in this, and in her story, I definitely see it as, you know, as somehow a seeking thing herself, and she used it to find her way in the world, her place in the world, from the beginning to the very end.
One thing that struck me about Larry that I found he could have developed a little bit more was the whole concept of survivor guilt, that he had to make his life worthwhile because somebody had given their life to give him his life. I wish, and I've met, I never served in the Army, but I've met veterans, and almost universally they say, why did I survive and my friend Harry didn't survive? So lots of times I think it comes out that they feel that their life has to mean something. And in Larry's case, I may not agree with his choice, but I think that's what he felt. His life had to mean something. And he didn't view Gray's life as meaning all that much. And he didn't view the life that Isabel saw for him as meaning a lot. So I may think that he was a little bit I don't know, quixotic or whatever. I don't even know the word, but at least I respect the fact that he was trying to find his place, and he wasn't going to allow anybody else to put him in his place.
If I can just add, about Hemingway and The Great Gatsby, I don't think our going back and reading those books now are they're necessarily meant to be enjoyable from our perspective. They are seminal. So literature changed. They were pivots that then literature changed after them. I think we can fairly say. As I said, this was an easy read, but I don't think that anything in this book after this, literature changed it all. I do think I go back to my original assessment that Maugham seems like from his writer's notebook. And for those who like this book, I do not recommend going back and reading the writer's notebook. That he seemed like quite an egoist and materialist. And I will, if I can just, if you'll stand a little more humor, I think the
we'll let you beat a dead horse. Go ahead.
Exactly. The truest line in the book, page 32, is from the narrator. Well, you know, when people are no good at anything else, they become writers.
Why do we have to like the writer? Why do we have to like him as?
I
don't
want
quite
to say
understand
something.
that.
I want to say something about The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby is an indictment of American materialism. From my point of view, beautifully written indictment of the loss of innocence in America and American materialism that ranks, I think, far above what we find in The Razor's Edge. And the business of, I think Ben talked about this a little bit, the business of liking characters. Okay, I'm going to harken back to Shakespeare. If you read Richard III, who murdered his nephews, and this great tragedy, do we like him? No. So I don't want to box myself in to having to like a character. I want to be fascinated by a character and drawn into the character. But liking is a whole other thing. Do we like Hamlet? I mean, I wouldn't want to spend 10 minutes with him.
You might end up dead.
Right. Yeah, like a bit.
So I want to say something with Ben. You said that meaningless. The book is meaningless, but in the end. But I wonder, even though it didn't influence literature like those other seminal books by the Lost Generation, maybe it was one of those books that influenced the Beats and the search for Eastern religion and led to the 60s in some, seeding way. So I wonder if there's some connection there. I wouldn't be surprised. My father, who is not a reader, read it multiple times when he was a young man. He was born in the early 30s, so you can do the math there.
I think
was he a fan of the beat poetry? Was he a fan of the beat poetry, etc.?
No, I don't think he was much of a fan of the arts in general.
Okay.
But the Beats, and I just did a quick search on it, the influences of The Razor's Edge on Wikipedia, and it said Maugham, like Hermann Hesse, anticipated this embrace of Eastern culture by almost a decade before the Beats were to popularize it. So I'm just wondering, if this meaningless book maybe had meaning to some people, and maybe there's a line from Larry to Yellow Submarine.
I think that's a good point, Mark, but I just want to say, I didn't say it was meaningless. I think that it's confusing and confused, but I think your point is actually valid, that maybe it did lead to the Beatles going out and meeting their yogi. But again, I go back, Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, I would say, is actually an excellent introduction done earlier and far more intelligently than this. So maybe popular culture got swayed by The Razor's Edge. I'll grant you that, but I don't think it and even its own purposes, did a good job of it.
I want to talk a little bit about why the Beats turned to Eastern religion. Americans have been doing that since the New England Transcendentalists. Walt Whitman was a student of Eastern religion. Henry David Thoreau was, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. That whole gang turned toward the East for enlightenment, and in some ways turned away from Christianity. Emerson left the church Whitman, I don't think, spent much time there at all. But that's where the influence was. And Allen Ginsberg certainly was a devotee of Walt Whitman and Thoreau and all of that. Maybe he read the Razor's Edge, I'm not sure. But the turning toward the East has a long, strong tradition in America.
Transcendentalism. Uh-huh.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And it's still going on. Buddhism right now is very, very important in American culture.
Yeah.
I don't mean the thought, Miriam. I mean, that's a really good point, but I did not mean that the thought that's in this book,
Right.
but the fact of the pilgrimage to India to find the answer,
That is
which is
there. That is there, certainly.
yeah.
This is a different point, and we certainly don't have time to it. But I never understand the romanticism of the East. When we talk about Buddhism, there's never been a country that's been Buddhist that hasn't been terribly prejudiced against anybody else in the country. Look at Burma. Look at look at Thailand. I think sometimes the Buddhism that we think of is, just the written Buddhism and, the James Hilton Buddhism of Shangri-La. I don't think it's ever been carried out anywhere. I don't know what the East can teach us all that much.
Well, Japan taught us a lot about economic development in the 80s.
Yeah, if you want to go the Chinese method, and put 1 million Muslims in a camp, I guess you could do that. Boy, that was a downer ending. Anyhow,
Well, let's talk about the movie real quick.
Doreen, I agree with you. I loved the book. I enjoyed it. It wasn't a page turner, but it had paragraphs that were just poetry to me.
Well, thanks,
Charles, you know what you're doing? You're making us all a little dizzy by spinning in your chair.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was. I forget I'm on camera. I'm sorry. Hey, God, I feel.
Did
I just
anyone
thought I'd mention it.
Hey, listen, Charles is tripping as he's.
There you go. There you go.
Yellow Submarine.
Computer.
Thank everybody. This is a lovely group. I look forward to getting together and bringing the grain, the whatever it's called, the buffalo grain vodka to our next.
Oh yeah.
Can anyone recommend the Bill Murray version of the movie? Did anyone see it? No, the one from the early 90s. Okay.
Oh, I haven't seen it.
Yeah, the other movie is flawed. They take the language and put it in other characters. They change the character of Larry tremendously.
Oh, I know. Plus, I think Tyrone Power was awful in it. I think that whole Elliot, what they did with Elliot, he was very well presented to a point, but then at the end when he's dying, they changed the whole ending, and they had Isabel and her husband walk in, and then he dies this stupid death after saying, "I can't come to your party," and he just boom, drops his head and dies. It's the stupidest thing I
a 7-part miniseries. This is a book that can't be done in an hour and a half.
No. The whole Indian experience was awful.
Anyone else with final thoughts or salutations?
I'm just wondering what our next book is. Someone remind me.
It's this one here.
We can't see what it says.
Islands of Silence.
Islands of Silence.
Okay.
Hi, thank you.
And it'll be March what?
Same date.
I mean, first Friday.
Same date as today.
Exactly. Yep. It's the 5th. And,
Oh,
and
okay.
305. That's the 305 day.
yeah. Oh, excellent. There we are. We're in the right area code. So I just want to, I want to, there's a paragraph that I'd like to share that I think is beautiful and very long. It's towards the end, 257. It says, "I had myself been to Seville when I was 23, and I too had liked it. I liked its white, tortuous streets, its cathedral, and the wide-spreading plain of the Guadalquivir. But I liked also those Andalusian girls with their grace and their gaiety, with their dark, shining eyes, the carnations in their hair stressing its blackness, and by the contrast itself more vivid. I liked the rich color of their skins and the inviting sensuality of their lips. Then indeed, to be young was very like heaven. So I think that's the narrator at his best, and perhaps Maugham at his best.
Very painterly. He's a very painterly writer.
It's a good one to leave on.
A bit
All
of
right.
generosity from Ben at the end.
Well, again, I hope I wasn't too downer. I kind of like it when there's some disagreement. So,
So do I. It was a great discussion.
was
okay.
very good.
Thank you for bearing with me and us.
It was very good. It was very enjoyable.
That was a fun discussion.
So
Thanks,
to
all.
Mark. Wonderfully done as usual.
Be well, everybody.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. See you in a month.
Thanks, Mark.
Long on the journey. I really wanted to read it. Thanks.
And so Miriam, we'll be talking. We'll see if you're back in March already, but we'll be in touch, okay?
Touch. Take care, everyone. Be
All right,
well.
take care.
well,
Bye.
Miriam.
Thanks.
Stay well.
You too. Good night.
Good night.